Greetings from MWN.com. Dr. M. Wilson, formerly Vice Principal and Head of Department of Commerce, Scott Christian College, Nagercoil, is delighted in presenting this session. Thank you. Please subscribe the channel MWN.com. Classification of costs. Costs may be classified on the following basis. 1. Element-wise classification. 2. Functional-wise classification. 3. On the basis of identifiability. 4. Behavior-wise classification. 5. On the basis of controllability. 6. On the basis of time. 7. On the basis of relevancy. 1. Element-wise classification. On the basis of element-wise, costs may be classified into a. Material cost, b. Labor cost, and c. Expenses. A. Material cost. The cost incurred for the purchase and storage of material is called material cost. Material cost is classified into I. Direct material cost and e. Indirect material cost. Direct material costs are those material costs which can be easily identified in a product. It can be easily allocated to the process of production. Indirect material costs are those material costs which cannot be easily identified in the product. It cannot be allocated but apportioned to the process of production. B. Labor cost. The cost incurred in the form of wages and salaries to the employees of a concern is called labor cost. Labor cost may be classified into I. Direct labor cost and e. Indirect labor cost. Direct labor costs are those labor costs which can be easily identified in a product. It can be easily allocated to the process of production. Indirect labor costs are those labor costs which cannot be easily identified in the product. It cannot be allocated, but apportioned, to the process of production. C. Expenses. The costs other than the material cost and labor cost are called expenses. Expenses are also classified into direct expenses and indirect expenses. Direct expenses are those expenses which can be easily identified in a product and can easily be allocated to the process of production. Indirect expenses are those expenses which cannot be easily identified but apportioned to the process of production. 2. Functional-wise classification. Classification of costs on the basis of the functions of an organization is called functional-wise classification. It may be classified into a. Production cost, b. Administration cost, and c. Selling and distribution cost. A. Production cost. The cost incurred in the factory or workplace of a concern is called production cost. It includes the cost of direct material, direct labor, direct expenses, and factory indirect expenses, factory overhead. The total of direct material, direct labor, and direct expenses is called prime cost. When factory overhead is added with prime cost, it is called production cost or factory cost. B. Administration cost. The cost of administration of an organization is called administration cost. It includes indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. Example: stationery, salary, traveling expenses, refreshment expenses, etc., incurred for the administration department. C. Selling and distribution cost. The costs incurred for selling and distribution of a product are called selling and distribution costs. It includes indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. Example: stationery, salary, traveling, refreshment expenses, etc., incurred for the selling and distribution department. 3. On the basis of identifiability. On the basis of identifiability, costs are classified into a. Direct costs, and b. Indirect cost. A. Direct costs. Direct costs are those costs which can easily be identified in a product. It can easily be allocated to the cost center. It includes direct material, direct labor, and direct expenses. B. Indirect costs. Indirect costs are those costs which cannot easily be identified in a product. It cannot be allocated to the cost center and it should be apportioned. It includes indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. 4. Behavior-wise classification of costs. On the basis of behavior, cost may be classified into a. Fixed cost, b. Variable cost, and c. Semi-variable cost. A. Fixed cost. The cost which remains constant up to a certain level of activity is called fixed cost. It may also be stated that the cost which would not change due to the changes in the volume of production. This cost should be incurred irrespective of the number of units manufactured. This cost should be incurred even though the company do not produce any units. Fixed cost per unit is variable. Example: salary to staff, rent, insurance, etc. B. Variable cost. The cost which changes according to the changes in the volume of production is called variable cost. It varies in direct proportion to the volume of production. Variable cost per unit remains fixed. Example: direct material, direct labor, direct expenses. C. Semi-variable cost. The cost which is partly fixed and partly variable is called semi-variable cost. Example: salary to salesman based on monthly salary plus commission, telephone charges, etc. 5. On the basis of controllability. On the basis of controllability, cost may be classified into a controllable cost and b. uncontrollable cost. A controllable costs. The costs which can be influenced by the action of the management of a concern are called controllable costs. Example: salary and wages, electricity, telephone charges, etc. B. Uncontrollable costs. The costs which cannot be influenced by the action of the management of a concern are called uncontrollable costs. Example: price of raw material, freight charges, etc. 6. On the basis of time. On the basis of time, costs are classified into a. historical cost and b. predetermined cost. A. Historical costs. Costs which have already been incurred are called historical costs. It is otherwise called as actual cost incurred for the production. B. Predetermined costs. Costs which are estimated in advance before the commencement of production are called predetermined costs. It is also known as estimated cost or standard cost. 7. On the basis of relevancy. On the basis of relevancy, costs are classified into a. relevant costs and b. irrelevant costs. A. Relevant costs. Relevant costs are those costs which are reliable for taking managerial decision. These costs are not subject to immediate changes. But relevant costs are subject to change in future due to the changes in the decision of management. B. Irrelevant costs. Irrelevant costs are those costs which are not relevant for taking managerial decision. These costs may change often and also it is difficult to estimate these costs.